in the midst of a huge transformation where our peers, communities, and workplaces are all really melding into one. Welcome to Reimagining Company Culture. My name is Christina Giordano, she, her, and hers, and I am the Senior Partnerships Manager here at AllVoices. Today, I am very excited to welcome our next guest onto the interview series, Gabrielle Gonzalez. She's the Director of People Experience at Sayge. Gabrielle, it's good to see you. If you want to share a little bit about yourself for our listeners, including your pronouns, and when you were younger, do you remember how exactly you answered the question, what do you want to be when you grow up?
Of course, yeah. I'm so excited to be here. So thank you for the opportunity. Gabrielle Gonzalez, you can call me Gabby, she, her pronouns, Director of People Experience at Sayge, like you said. And you know what's funny? I saw this question and I was like, I don't think so. There was nothing I ever wanted to be. And I asked my mom because I was like, I feel like everyone has something that they wanted to be when they were younger. But my parents were immigrants or are immigrants. And from when I was younger, all I remember them saying is like, you can be whatever you want. So I think very early on, I just didn't really subscribe to something because I knew that they would support me in whatever I decided. But what's funny is that at the playground, I remember I was constantly like mediating with people and solving problems. And my mom would go so far to say that like kids with ADHD, including my brother, would come up to me and I would kind of be the person on the playground, like teaching people how to share. So just to say, I think there was a little bit of an unspoken mission there in terms of working with people and being inclusive early on. And not to mention that got me to where I am today.
Incredible. I was a big playground kid as well. I loved going with my parents and also just interacting with everybody as well. And you're on and leading the people experience team at Sayge. How did your kind of personal journey specifically lead you to Sayge?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I'm someone that very much in some ways believes in universe, just kind of planning its way out, but also obviously through both intentional and subconscious decisions we make. But I grew up in New York City. Like I said, my parents are immigrants. My mom is from France and my father's from Colombia. I grew up in Chinatown until I was about 10. But growing up in Manhattan was very different, 20, 30 years ago. And I was just around a lot of different cultures and languages when I was very young. And so I remember going into the workforce then, or rather internships around the age of 17, 18. And I started working with homeless youth specifically, and then homeless adults and homeless families. And I just remember I was like, why can't work be enjoyable? And why can't the people who are receiving the service that you're offering, why can't they be treated properly? Or especially in the homeless services nonprofit world, it's just the systemic system is just pretty, I'd go so far as almost degrading to folks in that system. So anyways, I'd have people tell me that I was the best case worker that they ever had. And my peers would ask me, like, what are you doing? And I was just like, I'm just treating them like they're humans. Like I'm just, not necessarily a product. And so at that point in time, I noticed that I had a real knack for, really a real knack for working with people. And so, but I had no tangible business skills. So I really pivoted into HR at that point, or people work, because I just wanted to find a way essentially to create tangible business skills there. And so I did a brief stint in an ad agency in San Francisco. And then I needed to get back to mission-based work just because that's what makes my heart tick. And fast forward, I was at change.org for 5 years, was at the IRC for a little, and then I was struggling at my last job. And so I got a coach. I was accepted into a coaching program for young women in the social impact space. And at that point in time, I had never had a coach. Coaching is quite kind of ambiguous. It's still, people don't always know what it can provide you, which is part of what Sayge is trying to bring to light. And my coach at that point completely changed my life, and to the extent that I started to go to coaching school. And then I saw this job posting when I was very burnt out from my last job, and I was kind of looking around for other roles. And it was just, like I said to start, it just felt very universe. It was both at the point that I'm at in my career, I felt ready for that role. And then it was in the coaching space. And so I got the job. It was very much it was very much a dream job. And so that's how I got here.
I love it. I appreciate that context. It sounds like you're really passionate about coaching, about helping people. And I know we've talked a lot around how the language you use matters and thinking about the terms like employee engagement, company culture, and especially over the past few years, those terms and what they mean have definitely shifted, especially as we have shifted our expectations of our employers and leaders. From your perspective, how do you think we should be redefining the term employee engagement in a world of hybrid and remote work?
It's a really good question. Part of me wants to ask, does anyone out there know? Does anyone have the golden ticket? I think I think literally every person in my role or somewhere in the people space is asking themselves this question. So I think about it all the time. But just to say, I think where I've landed in the last couple of years, and the pandemic specifically, of course, is that what really matters is not what we do, but rather the approach that we take. And so, for example, I think we all kind of attended one of those happy hours or what have you at the start of the pandemic. And my personal story around why those, died off was because it's really hard to translate those innately human moments into a virtual environment. So I think we'd all rather have a drink with our friend at the bar, for example. But my theory right now and kind of how I lead my engagement work is that the approach that we take that doesn't change whether we're virtual or online is if you build from a community standpoint, an inclusion standpoint, and then a growth standpoint. I think humans, no matter where they are, want to feel those three things. And so how that's boiled down into a strategic perspective for me is really thinking about the collective versus the team. In person, when we were in person more at any company, it was easy to focus on the individual. But now I think teams are really the future. So from a collective standpoint, I think you can think of ERGs for community, monthly training opportunities, upskilling on your values, any of the systems and processes needed for asynchronous work, all things that are teaching us something about the virtual world that we live in. And then from a team perspective, I think HRBPs, for example, are coming to fruition for a reason. The HR field, the people field is no longer only seen as a horizontal, but as a vertical, and empowering teams what they need from a training perspective, from a management perspective. And so for me, engagement is less of a one size fits all at this point. And it's really like figuring out how to translate human psychology into how people will essentially be engaged in the virtual world. But always open to talk to anyone else who is asking themselves those same questions.
Yes, a lot of folks asking those questions and seeking answers. If there was a golden ticket or a playbook, I'm sure it would be one of the most downloadable on the internet today. Community, inclusion, and growth are definitely things that we continuously talk about on this interview series, and also a lot of leaders in the HR space as well. And in terms of the vertical or department or space, there's been a lot of change in terms of how we think about human resources, people teams, people operations teams. I know you changed the name of your team to specifically people experience. And again, the words we use matter. So I want to ask why it was important to you to really define people experience, and what does that mean in practice?
Definitely. Yeah, we're getting PX trending over here at Sayge. So I like the shift in name. So people experience for us is really the people strategy that's rooted in the vision, mission, and values of the company. And the workplace experiences and the employee lifecycle that people interact with the entire time that they're here. For us at Sayge, we're really motivated by that because of our ambitions of unlocking human potential and then also just creating an amazing place to work. So that's kind of the ethos and reason why we chose it. But the reason for the name, quite literally, I have to thank our founders, honestly. And it's part of what attracted me to the role specifically. Part of the reason, I mean, we've had conversations about it, but what I would say is so important is that they're coming from a place of hiring me to start building the foundations and to be innovative and to keep the space there to really imagine what our people experience team in the future of work could look like, versus coming in at a point where I'm starting from a place of fixing things that might already be broken. And so it's a really slight shift in thinking. But I think when HR leaders or people leaders are brought in at a time where there's already something quote unquote wrong, you're already starting off on the right foot, and that you're not necessarily working for the people, but you're working to mitigate risk. And so for us at Sayge, it's really been about our tagline is never stop growing. Like I said, we unlock human potential. And so for us, it's a values and a brand decision. And it's also a first impression. We want our coaches and our community feel that way. And of course, our staff internally. So I hope that it inspires other companies to do the same.
Absolutely. And people experience teams and people operations teams, I feel like there is a lot of creativity and innovation that needs to be thought about because people are changing all the time. Psychology is important to the conversation, as you were saying, people at different parts of their careers, different parts of their lives. And it encapsulates a lot in terms of the employee experience from pre-day one to year 5, year 6, the exit interview, being an alumni of the organization. Is there a piece of the employee life cycle that you think often gets kind of overlooked? And if so, what is that kind of stage that people need to intentionally continue to cultivate?
Yeah, this might sound like the easy answer, but I really think the holistic piece is often not looked at. I think HR leaders are so caught up in the day-to-day often because so much of what we do is reactive that we sometimes forget to come out, or the company forgets to come out and really look at the big picture. I think what ends up happening sometimes is we pigeonhole into one aspect of the employee life cycle. So to give you an example, when I was at change.org, I built out the first ever onboarding program. I'd say onboarding is probably the most important to some extent for the employee life cycle. And I think my learning and feedback at that point for myself would be, how are we thinking about retention as a whole? Just because after that we saw dips, right, in engagement at the 2-year mark, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's, to answer your question, I think it's less about looking at a specific point and really understanding when people are disengaged. Why are they disengaged? There's always cultural evidence lying in some part of the employee life cycle. And so even in exit interviews, pay attention to why people are leaving, and really figuring out how to essentially onboard people into different parts of the employee life cycle. So onboarding them into parental leave, onboarding them into their sabbatical, onboarding them into, et cetera, programs that you create.
I think that definitely makes sense because I think oftentimes we think about these key moments in silos. When we think about retention, we're also looking for a silver bullet or just like a golden ticket to say this is what retains people, but it's about that entire experience. It's about having that holistic strategy and thinking about it in that way as well. For the cultural evidence and for people to really give feedback to continuously improve processes, you need to build trust. It doesn't just happen because you will it to or because you have a good intention, but you take steps to, just like any relationship, build that trust from the beginning and continue to foster it. Some organizations say, we have an open door policy, but we know that historically a lot of employees and team members have been hesitant to go to human resources teams or people teams for a variety of reasons. A lot of people are bringing lived experiences, even if you work at the best place currently now. What are some methods that you've used in the past to really build trust to your organization and encourage folks to not only surface issues and negative or constructive feedback, but positive feedback as well to see what's working to specifically HR people teams?
Totally. This is such I think, a fascinating conversation and tension in the people space. I think for me, it's funny. It kind of goes back to what I said about myself earlier in working in case management, and that I really just treat people as humans from the get-go. So I believe in building cultures that enable and catalyze human potential and strategy versus working from a place of compliance and risk. And that said, compliance, risk, and the unsexy part of people team and HR will always be a part of the job. But I think for me, and the advice I'd give to companies is if you're starting from a place of empowerment and enrichment and really seeing people as themselves, then what ends up happening, and not to mention being intentional about that from the start. My goal and what I tell people is that I would love for 80 to 90% of my job to actually be the positive parts of HR, because that means that I trained people really well to give feedback, to know their growth, to understand how to navigate conflict, et cetera. And so that's not to say that any of those less sexy parts go away, but you're instead, like I said at the start, not coming from a place of risk and trying to make things not happen, but you're building from a place of like, hey, we can be your partners. Let us be your partners and people that celebrate you along the way. And I think that shift in thinking is huge. For myself specifically, I do a lot of stuff. I do a lot of aspects of, not a lot of aspects, it's not English, but I do a lot of listening to staff. I am very in tune at all times with how staff are feeling, which I think having an ear to the ground, especially as you get more senior, is absolutely necessary. For my work, I always approach it from, I do a DEI audit before I approach my work, to basically see if my work is going to impact specific populations. If it is, how I reset. And I also, to that same notion, I reset expectations. If I can't do something, I hold myself accountable and explain what I learned and why I shifted if I need to. And so I think that has changed my relationship with staff. And while, of course, like I said, there's a line, especially in this day and age with people in the HR space, I think there's always going to be that power that you have with a people position. While I agree with that in theory, like I said, I think if you're leading people first to begin with, then people actually coming to you from a place of risk tells me there's something wrong with your culture.
Gabrielle, you mentioned a couple times just you leading with people first and treating people as humans perspective. What is your advice for other folks who are operators or practitioners in the space to really put human back in human resources and people experience teams?
Sure. So I'd say number one is to lead with your values. I think a lot of companies have their values on the wall, but they're not necessarily operationalized. So really using them, if you're imagining culture as a road, really using them as your GPS, and your managers, I'd say almost as the road signs, and have someone hold you accountable to those. Don't be afraid to change them if you need to, and don't be afraid to apologize if you miss the mark, to iterate, to innovate. And like I said, we're humans first. So I say understanding your people is huge. And people honestly just want to know that you have the best intention in mind, their intention, and that you're always trying to do the right thing. And so, yeah, I think that would be my advice to people teams. Just stay clued into your people, see them first, and iterate where needed, both for the business and for the better good of your mission and the people you're serving.
Yeah, I think it's part one is having those values. Where's our North Star and what we believe in, having them on the in-person or virtual kitchen wall, if you will. And then, the values really come through in the actions that you celebrate, the conversations that you have, the meaningful connections that are created in the spoken and unspoken cultural norms at the organization as well. And again, that intentionality is so important, being authentic, and really making sure you're putting in that intentional effort to understand how employees want to be seen, heard, and understood. I would also love to ask June 2022, how is Sayge honoring and celebrating Pride this year, recognizing that I'm sure this is something that you and the team are doing 365 days a year with employees and also specifically folks who identify from the LGBTQIA+ community.
Yeah, so this is something that I'm excited to build more of at Sayge. We're a small team of about to be 14. So I haven't, this is my third week, so I haven't implemented the strategy around how we're going to celebrate awareness months. That being said, myself and a couple of coworkers at change.org partnered with ERGs to do this almost every month at my old job. So I think that will be a huge part of what we do. I think for this month, we'll probably do some sort of lunch and learn or webinar just to kind of get the DEI conversation in more of a rhythm. But I'll be honest and say that I'm still getting my feet on the ground, so won't be doing as much as the bar I hold myself to in the future.
Excited to continue to keep in touch and see all of the things that you and Sage do in the future as well. Gabrielle, is there anything that I didn't ask in our conversation today that you want to share with folks who are listening, or maybe underscoring a couple of key takeaways that you hope people bring with them about, leading with that people first mentality, and being rooted in values, anything like that?
I think the biggest thing I would say coming from the tech space myself is to hire someone such as myself or a person earlier than you think. I know tech companies right now that are 2 to 3 people, and some of the issues that come up, I'm like, hey, you should have a consultant or like a coach that talks about your values, etc. But I really, really would encourage anyone who's listening to this that's either on the verge of hiring a people person that it really is never too early. It's never too early to be growing your people strategy alongside why the company exists. And to some extent, I'm still baffled why those are separated for many folks. So I would say that. And then the last thing I would say, which I said before, is just to remain approachable, authentic in your leadership. People gravitate towards vulnerability, and balance that with hard data. I think we're entering a phase where a lot of folks try to understand whether we should act on something for staff based on what's in the data versus what's being said. And I think part of leading human first is that you understand truly how your people are feeling and you let them be the best iteration of your product, because I've seen companies that don't lead that way. And yeah, they're not nearly as successful as the other companies that do lead people first. So thanks so much.
Yeah, absolutely. Your people are the ones working on the product or service, they're the ones on the front lines, and your managers as well. So setting people up for success is so important, continually asking for that feedback and cultivating an environment of high trust is important. Gabrielle, thank you so much for being on Reimagining Company Culture this afternoon.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
Of course, and as a reminder for folks who are listening, at AllVoices, we really believe in employees and employers being seen, heard, and understood, and know it's a requirement for the business to really succeed overall. Have a great rest of your day, everyone.